New York and on the new Hot 97 app. Ebro in the morning on Hot 97.
Ebro in the morning. Beautiful Laura Stiles, Rosenberg. Give it up for Lurie Daniel-Favors on the program. Like literally my family is on the program. And literally.
Why do you have to say literally when it's almost accurate, but you could have gone literally my friend?
Well, because she's more than my friend.
Whoa, what are you trying to say?
Meaning she's my best friend's wife.
Ah, so it's family adjacent.
Meaning like she could call me and be like, yo, my man, check this out. You fucking up, straighten it out. And I'd have to be like, yo,
right.
I don't know that I would ever use those words in that way, but I'm.
It's possible, though.
It's possible. It's possible.
I've spent many years with Lurie on Kwanzaa.
Yes.
Her husband is somebody I've known since high school. We were in the R&B group together.
Oh,
Answer.
my goodness. And we got pictures to prove it.
Yeah, Tomorrow's Answer.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes,
Great group.
indeed.
Really underrated group.
Yo, would you
Very
tell her
much so.
Don't you
I mean,
think?
they had moves, they had
I know.
routines.
And
I
yet
mean,
you feel like no one talks about them. It's not
a
right.
shame.
Yeah,
It's a shame. All the great music. And you just
All
see
the
all the
music
great
they made.
artists, they just, they don't get the
Isn't
love.
there a BET Unsung coming
There
up?
is. There is.
Behind the music, all of that.
Yo, we inspired a generation.
That's right. I
Tomorrow's
know.
Answer. But Lurie is here because you are working with the Census 2020.
Yes.
And specifically hyper-focused on making sure black folks and brown folks understand the impact of not participating.
Right. Exactly. And for us, when we say black folks and brown folks, we're really talking about the Pan-African diaspora because, and it's going to show up really interestingly as it pertains to race on the census, whether you are from the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad, Ghana, Nigeria, Alabama, Brooklyn, you are all included under that flag that Marcus Garvey was talking about when he talked about the Pan-African community. And all of us have a very, very, very high risk at not showing up on the census because traditionally we do not for a whole host of reasons. And when we don't show up on the census, we are essentially locking our communities into being underfunded and underpolitically represented for decades at a time. And so it's a major issue.
So I want to start right there because I've filled out the census ever since I can remember.
Excellent.
Before it would say African American on there. I would literally cross it out and I would write in black.
Yeah.
Just because, and I've done it multiple times with a Sharpie. But I still don't understand how that affects money coming into a specific zip code.
Right. So it works like this. Every single dollar that we get from the government, whether it's for SNAP, WIC, affordable housing programs, college preparation programs, subways, hospital beds, schools, librarians in the schools, teachers, everything that you can think of is basically funded based on these formulas that are determined by census count. So what happens is every 10 years, the federal government counts every single person, regardless of your citizenship. They count every single person in the country. And in your community, they take that total population count for your community and they just feed it into the formulas. It's very non-emotional. It's very just mathematic. They feed those population counts into these formulas. And at the end of that formula comes, this community has this many people, so they get this much money for SNAP. They get this much money for WIC. They get this much money for affordable housing in every single one of those programs. What traditionally happens is communities of African descent do not show up on the census, and we can talk about why in just a moment. But because we don't fill out the census, because we have a lot of fears about the census, our population counts end up being artificially small. So at the end of those formulas, we end up getting far less money than we're entitled to. If you think about it in terms of school, let's say we live in a mythical nation called Wakandaville. And in Wakandaville, we have 100 children who live in 100 families. And according to the federal formulas for census for school funding, that community should get $100 in school funding for all of that community to be serviced. But if only 40 of those families fill out the census, that means instead of getting $100 for school funding, that community is only going to get $40 for school funding. But what happens in September is all 100 of those children show up to school, but they're only going to get education services that are appropriately budgeted for the amount of 40. So when you think about what that looks like in terms of college preparation programs, in terms of hospitals and healthcare, senior citizen centers, if your community is only showing up on the census at 40%, you're literally getting 40 cents on the dollar. What's doubly worse about that is those formulas last for a 10-year period. So if in 2010 you did not fill out the census and your community did not fill out the census, we're literally still dealing with the lack of funding based on the 20 cents.
And then it's compounded because those things impact you behaviorally, with your health, your mental health, all of these things.
Absolutely.
And so you could be a 5-year-old that's now 15. You can be a 10-year-old that's now 20 and trying to figure your life out, and it's all because your schools didn't have the proper funding.
They were underfunded, understaffed, whatever it may be.
From kindergarten, elementary, middle school, and high school.
So in theory, is what you're saying based more on community and location, but it affects people of color the most?
Well, because we live in hyper-segregated communities.
Right.
So yes to both of those things. And so if you live in a community like Bedford-Stuyvesant or Brownsville or Harlem, you are literally living around people who very much look like you, who share the same fears that you do about government and about participating in something like the census. And as a result, traditionally, year over year over year, we end up being underfunded. So for example, if you're living in my community, you might walk 4 or 5 blocks before you can find a trash can, right? Before you could, so you literally, if you're trying to keep your community clean, you got to hold on to whatever trash you have in your hand for 4 or 5 blocks before you can find a place to properly dispose of it. Whereas if I go to Park Slope, which is a very white community, and white communities tend to have over-representation on the census, and we can talk about why in a moment, you might find a trash can on every single corner of every single intersection. Mm-hmm. So literally the physical infrastructure for maintaining the cleanliness of your community is underfunded in such a way that it compounds the lack of resources that we already have.
On the Upper West Side, if I get to a corner and there's no trash can, I'm appalled.
Yes.
It's shocking.
Yes.
It's like, no, and usually it comes back. It's like, oh, there's something going on.
Right.
And then the next day you see it there again.
Exactly.
It's crazy because I see the difference. I lived in Harlem for over 15 years.
Yeah.
Now I live downtown. And I had to go through that exact thing. I had to hold on to trash when I'm out in the street because I couldn't find it.
Guess what most people don't do? Hold on to trash.
Exactly.
They just let go of it. So let's get into, sorry, Laura.
No. Let's get into some of the misconceptions that people have, some of the fears around the census, because a lot of people are like, I don't want to give my information. That's personal, blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah.
and the other reasons why people are not doing it or overdoing it.
Well, now with the ICE thing.
Boom. Okay, so we just celebrated 2019, which was the 400-year commemoration of the introduction of enslavement of Africans into this country, right? And we're actually kind of 100 years off because our Latinx brothers and sisters experienced that. They began experiencing that over 100 years before we did. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Hispaniola, which is now Dominican Republic, Haiti, like in the early 1500s, right? So the first time strangers who don't look like us come knocking on our doors asking for information, you open that door, your entire village that night might end up on the bottom of a slave ship.
Well, that's why black people answer the door the way they do now. Who is it?
There you go.
Is that why?
Who is
Is that why black people get so sensitive about playing on the phone?
Don't play on my phone.
Don't play on the phone.
Play.
And if someone shows up at your door and you did not know they were coming, shh. Be quiet. We're not answering the door, and I don't want anybody knowing that we're here. So I remember even as a child, my mother being like, "Who? Like, no, be quiet. Turn off the TV." Like,
Well, my dad used to scream at the door like he was about to shoot through it.
listen.
And white people are like, hello! Come on, who is it? Come on in! Yo, that's
Right,
crazy,
right.
though, how deep that goes back.
Well, yeah, but if you think about it, that trauma doesn't end. So like even throughout the course of enslavement, like anyone coming to your door, your loved one might be stolen away. And even after slavery, you fit a description. Or we all saw, Claudine, where, a man living in the house might mean that you don't get access to social services. So the ability to disrupt who is in the house based on information
By
is
the way,
historical.
everybody hasn't seen Claudine.
And did I just date myself? I think I just dated
No,
myself.
A, you didn't date yourself, but B, people don't even remember that was a movie.
Wow. So basically, like in the early 1900s and, going up until the civil rights movement, your ability to get access to social services like food stamps, like healthcare, was contingent on whether or not you had 2 adults in the house. So if you had a man in the house who might be under or unemployed, they basically would be able to come into your house, investigate who was there, and determine whether or not you were going to get access to those
Now,
health
mind
services.
you, joblessness, getting a job as a black man, even trying to figure it out, so you could be, just like right now, you could be employed
Right.
and not gainfully employed.
Correct.
Right.
So imagine what that was at the turn of the century America. Sharecropping. Things like that where people are trying to just figure out how to survive.
Right, so they're working and they're spending a ton of time doing it, but they're not making enough
So
money
black
to
men
be-
would hide.
Exactly.
So that the mom could get a little extra because he couldn't make extra.
Right,
Right.
and it wasn't enough.
Right. Never was enough. And so having our families disrupted and interrupted by the state is something that we're used to. And so hiding from the census is sort of the natural outgrowth of that. But what that means is because we don't understand how these systems work and how our communities are funded, which makes sense. We only got the right to register to vote without being lynched for it, like in 1965. So if you know somebody who's like 56 or older, they're literally older than integration.
And it didn't stop there.
It didn't stop there. So now we have compounded issues with ICE, right? We have people who are intentionally coming into our communities. We have policing practices. We're stop and frisk. Okay, yeah, it's diminished, but we're still seeing racial disparities where black and brown people are intentionally targeted by actors of the state in ways that make us hiding from the census. It actually makes a whole lot of sense. It's self-preservation. What we have to do now, though, is as opposed to being really disempowered by that history, we have to use that history to inform how we move forward so we can be more sophisticated about how we engage and how we funnel resources into our community. So we at the Center for Law and Social Justice, which is a law center based at Medgar Evers College, we started in 1986 explicitly to deal with issues of African descendant communities here in the city of New York. We created the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition for Census 2020, which is a Pan-African coalition that is literally having this conversation with every single organization we can get in touch with, every single person of African descent that we can encounter to really, one, educate the community, distribute information and materials so that they can become the trusted voices in their community, and really ensure that people are going to be prepared for this version of the census, which is actually going to be a very different version of the census than we've ever seen before.
What's on it that's different?
What's different?
So, well, this time, for the first time, it's digital, right? So as opposed to getting a paper form in your mailbox, what you're going to get is a postcard. And that postcard is going to have a unique identification number on it. And you'll be able to take that identification number and literally go online, go on your phone, on your desktop, and fill out the census. It's 10 questions, 10 minutes that literally determines the funding and political allocation for the next 10 years.
But it has to come from this postcard.
It will come from the postcard, or in addition to the postcard, you can also call in your information now. So as opposed to going online, because, if you're like my grandmother, may she rest in peace, the last thing you're going to do is put any information in on the internet. No. But you can pick up the phone and you can call in the information. And if you don't do either of those things, by April, you will receive a paper form in the mail. So you have three options, basically: the online option, the phone option, or the paper option. Now, what happens is if you don't pick any of those three options, then that's when they send enumerators to your home. Enumerators are census employees who basically their job is to figure out how many people live in this home so that they can get as accurate a count as possible. But what that means is
you ain't opening the
strangers
door.
Knocking at the door, right? So if I'm an enumerator and I come to your door and you don't answer, I might ask, Joe Schmo out on the street, hey, do you know who lives here? And they might be like, yeah, there's one or two people who live there. Meanwhile, it's you, your cousins, your aunties, 3 children, and 2 grandparents or elders who need access to services. But because you didn't take one of the 3 options ahead of time to fill out the census, you basically are cutting yourself out of political
Well, and
power
also,
and
too,
funding.
for the people out there that are willing to fill out, what is it called, like IQ surveys and put in all your behavior on the internet, or like photos on Facebook, but you're afraid to actually fill out this information, you're playing yourself.
Right. Or
Because
you
they
shopping
already
on
have your
Amazon.
behavior, your zip code,
Well,
where
they're
you
giving you-
shop.
it's-
If you've shopped on Amazon, they have your zip code.
Exactly.
If you've done any sort of liking of your friends, whatever, they know who you are and who your friends are. If you post photos of your children, guess what? They know you got kids.
Well, not
if
only
they
that,
want
you're
to.
also giving your information to businesses who want to make money off of you,
Right.
foreign governments who we've learned we should not be trusting with our information.
Right.
And this is actually something that could help you.
Right. And because in addition to money, it also determines how many political representatives that you get. So go back to that example of Wakandaville. If you have a community of 100 people, and according to the census formulas, those types of communities should have 10 legislators assigned to them, but only 40 of your families filled it
getting
out.
4.
You're only going to get 4, which means when you're fighting bail reform, when you're fighting stop and frisk, when you're fighting for affordable housing, you're literally short 6 of the votes that
But
you would
guess
be entitled
what?
to.
The other town, let's call it, I don't know, Honkyville.
Oh.
They have... No, let's say another community that's
I like
different than yours
Honkyville. Right.
has 100...
Crackerville, too.
Lynchville. I've seen
Lynch-
there's literally a Lynchville.
Lynchburg.
Lynchburg.
Right.
There's plenty of those.
Right.
So that community has 100, and they're fully involved in the census. Well, now they have 10 representatives to your 4. So forget getting across, electing the official or getting across the legislation that you care about, when the other views are going to be more represented.
And Lynchburg actually is probably going to have 100 plus because Lynchburg tends to overrepresent.
So what does overrepresented mean? How does
So
it happen?
let's imagine we have a
Liars.
Why would you lie, though?
No, but they count
Because you're a liar.
everyone.
Do we have to do this again? Why would you lie?
All right.
Because you're a liar and you've lied forever?
But why would
But
you lie
the
about a
census
census?
is per
So
household.
because
or
you
per
know you're going to
person?
get more money.
Both.
Who knows, Ebro? Now I think
All
you're
right.
overstating. Now you're overstating, I think, the evil in this. You think the regular average person's like... The same way I think that people in communities of color are uninformed about the census, I would imagine a lot of what... I've never heard a word about the census in my entire life.
But there's a
I feel like
different
people are just
cultural
nerdy and
relationship.
diligent about doing it and
Right.
don't mind doing it.
Right.
No, but Ebro's point is, they're like, let's get extra representatives.
Yes.
Who's doing that?
Well, it's a different
Liars.
cultural relationship, right? So just like I said, that 400-year history of African-American people and African-descendant people participating in the census is based on fear of government. In white communities, the fear is not there.
Correct.
Because white communities know that when the government passed the Homestead Act, like in the 17 and 1800s, after they cleared the entire West of Native American people, indigenous people, they basically told white families, hey, go out west. You can have 5 acres. You can set up a house. You can set up a farm. We're going to turn you into landowners and homeowners overnight. This is like the first instance of affirmative action. And so they know that when Grandpa came back from the war, he got to use all his GI benefits. He got to use all his Veteran Affairs benefits. So the relationship between white communities and government is such that it is one that we will happily or more freely give over information because we are clear that when we give over information, good things come to us. So the historical and the cultural relationship is very different. But in that Lynchburg community, not only are mom and dad going to count all of the children because they're not going to worry about the children who they're taking care of, who may not actually be theirs, who they do or do not claim on taxes. They're going to count all of the grandparents because they're not worried about having to convince grandma and grandpa about being included. They're going to count all the uncles, all the aunties. They're going to pick up the phone and call Junior and Juniorette, who's away at college, and remind them to fill out the census. And then, oh, we have a summer home. I'm going to make sure that I'm also counted in my summer home because I am clear that when I participate, benefits come to me.
Forgot about the summer home hustle.
Forgot about the summer home. So
But that would be for a different community. So you're being counted in two communities.
and making sure that your privilege and power follow you wherever to which you may go.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's deep, see?
Yeah.
That's Lurie.
No, this is big talk. I mean, I've never had a census talk like this. And I would think, though.
Well, you guys were looking at me sideways because I've been talking on the radio for the census is coming, man. We got to talk about the census.
Well, I would still argue that that the biggest disparity just comes down to the basic lack of trust from one community and over trust from another community. I'm not saying there aren't other people in this category you just described, but I think probably the predominant thing is that white people are just like, oh, sure, I don't care.
Right.
Yeah,
Take it
for
all.
sure. But the same thing happens with radio ratings.
Yes, correct.
Same thing happens with any type of survey. Any type of survey adversely affects the communities that we speak to the most, which is why it's harder for our ratings to be as high as they possibly.
And it all comes down to stop playing on my phone. Who would have thought that? Wow. We did a bit once on the air of prank calling random black people to see how they would respond to a prank phone call. Every time it's bad.
Well, we even have the listeners participate. Yo, if you have a family member that gets super angry when you call them and you're the wrong person, give us the
And we
number
wouldn't
so
even do anything.
can call
All we would basically do is be like, hello, is so-and-so there? Wrong person.
Right.
And just to see how mad people would get. I had no idea the level of sort of the cultural thing that it's actually speaking to.
Yeah. There are historical reasons for everything.
Although
that we
I would
do.
think as a result that there would be white descendants of immigrants from other countries, Jews, for example, who would also be hesitant about government involvement because of the history of their family going back was one of when the government comes to the door.
But it's been easier for Jews to hide too, though, sometimes. Because you can't just look at a Jew and go, oh, you're Jewish, unless, of course, you're a stereotypical,
the physical
representation of it.
But what we do find in New York City is that Orthodox Jews and
they're
they tend to also be undercounted on the census. So when we're looking at the groups who are the least counted of the least counted, African descendant men and black children under the age of 5 and Orthodox Jews and Jewish members who are.
That's why Orthodox Jews are out here making their own ambulances and shit.
Man.
Well, and see the difference is when you're able to be self-empowered,
It doesn't mean
you can ameliorate a lot of the harm. When you are not, then you're dealing with traditionally underfunded communities.
How do the Latino communities do?
So it's interesting. They also tend to be undercounted. And what's going to be very interesting on this census is that the racial categorization shows up in a very different way than it has traditionally. So usually what happens is when it gets to the category about black, people will often hit other. They will often write in nationalities. Like, so my mother's family's from Jamaica, so they would write in Jamaican if they're filling it out. They would write in Nigerian, write in Ghanaian, and they would not check a race. And if you look at some of the racial categories, it will suggest for white, Egyptian, or some of the North African countries, because race is a very funky, weird little construct, and it really varies country by country. So when
and let's add in, when you came to America, you did not want to be associated with the former slaves. So whatever category y'all call them, we don't want to be in that box.
Right.
Even if we might look like them.
Right. Black is a very American way of thinking about race, right? So there was a period when I lived in the Dominican Republic and I was studying the role of race in Latin American culture. And I would introduce myself as a Black American when the question was asked. And they were like, no, you're India. And I was like, no, I'm not India. I really am Black. Like, that's okay. But the reality is you can go into a whole host of Latinx communities or Latinx countries, and there might be 13, 14, 20 different ways of identifying racially or colorly, I guess is the word, but without referencing blackness, right? And so when we think about that, that's significant because less than 10% of the enslaved Africans came to the United States of America. The vast majority went to Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries. So when we talk about the Pan-African diaspora, it's predominantly outside of the U.S. that we're talking about. And so in Latinx communities, as in many even African-American communities, the word Black is very political. So there are some Black Americans I know who are like, no, I'm African-American or I'm Afro-American. They do not embrace the term Black. However, the challenge is that Dominican, Nigerian, Puerto Rican, Ghanaian, Trinidadian, those are not protected racial categories. So on the census, if all you do is identifying as a nationality, you are essentially removing your community from the protections that come with the
Black
racial
people been trying to tell y'all to ride with us. Y'all want to come in and act like you something else. We told you you was Black. They gonna think you Black. You Black.
So what we tell people is, listen, the census is not the place for you to have this internal struggle about how you identify, right? Like if you are Dominican, but you are constantly mistaken as a Black American. If you are Nigerian and you are always seen as a Black American because phenotypically your exterior looks Black, how we would define it in this country, this is not the place to have some internal dialogue about how I'm really not Black, I'm this, that, or the other. Listen, when it comes to policing, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the issues that matter, you are Black. Sickle cell infects Black communities, Pan-African. Prostate cancer, hypertension, diabetes impacts Black communities regardless of nationality. So the first time on the 2020 census, you won't have to choose. African descendant communities will be able to do both, write in nationality and indicate race, which is significant because what we're saying is, listen, write in Dominican, write in Ghanaian, write take your 23 and read me,
your culture, all
put your
that.
nation down, do whatever you got to do. Your Yoruba, boom, put it down. But on the next question for race, you have got to check Black. Because if I'm the Center for Disease Control and I have money for sickle cell, I have money for prostate cancer, diseases that are ravaging African American and men of African descent, and you don't put that down, you're not getting my research dollars. You're not going to get my medical dollars. You're not going to get any of my investments. If it comes to education programs, and yes, we understand that there are distinctions between Black and brown communities, but we basically live in the same spaces and we suffer from the same issues. If you are not racially identifying...
And use the same hair care products and
boom,
the barbers. The
there it
hairstyles
is.
is the same. Let's keep it 100.
There it
if
is.
you go to the same barber with Black folks, you're Black.
Well,
Right.
there's one group that we know has different hairstyles than everyone else, particularly beard. And that'll be Dominicans. They deserve their own box. Let's be honest. Dominican barbershop, different ballgame altogether. Mustache game, way different.
I'm not touching that. So we just have to be way more sophisticated as people of color dealing with these issues.
If race doesn't matter, which we know that it does, in how the government deals with us, because you see this politicized,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Identity politics. Why is it still on the census? Why isn't culture and nationality the leading conversation? Why is race still there?
So to get a question changed on the census requires an inordinate amount of time, energy, and activism. In fact, Trump, y'all's president, tried to put in a citizenship question on the census.
Yeah, I saw
and
that.
we fought that in court, and we were a part of the team that my office represented the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic Legislative Caucus as amici in that case. And that case went up to the Supreme Court, and a number of folks, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, ACLU, were fighting this issue across the country. And that question has been removed from the census because they did not even follow their own procedures in trying to get it inserted. To have that level of activism around changing questions on the census requires a lot of energy that most people are not organized enough to put in. And then we have to think about how race shows up in this country. So we don't typically deal with people based on culture. We deal with people based on race. We have protections that are afforded based on race. America has a very weird, and I would not even say good, but a very weird way of dealing with its racial history. And so having these boxes...
Well, it's because race is in the history. Jim Crow is in the history.
Exactly.
Your complexion is in the history.
Yeah.
Your appearance is a part of how they dealt with you in history.
Exactly.
Back to the Homestead Act.
It's the foundation of the country, too.
Right. Absolutely. So I think what we have to ask is, as opposed to how come these questions or other questions aren't on the census, how do we take what we have and make it work for us? How do we make sure that we are engaged? We need the hip hop community to be talking about this, and particularly because we are all afraid of filling out this information. We need people to recognize that come March 12th, when those postcards start hitting your mailbox, pick up your phone, dial it in, type it in, do whatever you have to
How much bread y'all
do.
got? We can get these rappers. If y'all can give me a budget, we'll go ahead and get these rappers.
Well, I have zero bread, but what I do have is love for Black people. So what I need our community to recognize is that basically ain't nobody coming to save us, right? And so all the issues that we have are compounded by we're talking almost $700 billion every single year is distributed based on these formulas. So when we don't show up, we literally leave money on the table that other communities get to scoop up. We leave political representation on the table that other communities get to scoop up. So it's like we're going into battle with two hands and one leg tied behind our back.
So you don't work for the government?
No. Sorry, I didn't say,
But
say that.
Well, no, but the reason I say that is because we have been asked to have Griff who? From the census?
This is the director of the New York Census. I
Jeff Baylor.
It's a female. I have to find her name.
Okay.
A woman. But the reason I wanted to make sure you came first so that we had a more granular ethnically specific conversation, because I got to imagine that when they come in from the government, it's going to be a much more broad, generic.
Right.
We really need Black and Latinos to participate convo, but not getting into the
history,
who, what, when, and why of
exactly.
it. Right.
Kathleen Daniel, the field director.
Oh, okay. So she's worked with the city of New York, and so she will have that. She will have that.
Kathleen Daniel.
Yeah, she'll have that conversation, and it will be very government appropriate.
Got it. You watched Super Tuesday. You've been paying attention to the landscape. You're very vocal on social media with regard to progressive ideas. Are you a Bernie, Elizabeth
No,
Warren?
I was actually a very strong. I've wanted Elizabeth Warren to run for office since she created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Before she was even any elected position, I had a feeling that her approach to issues, she's very smart. I feel like she's one of the smartest candidates that they have. She has a racial justice analysis that centers not just equity, but racial justice equity. So I was sad to see the outcome yesterday, but I recognize that people of African descent are voting in ways that they think are going to produce the best outcomes. And quite frankly, we do not trust white Americans to vote in a way that's going to benefit.
Well, based on how white women and men showed up for Trump.
The stats don't lie.
So he's a big Warren endorser. He went out and said you officially endorsed Warren.
Well, I did it too late. I should have done it a month ago, but it took me a while to get there. I loved her the whole time. Didn't know she was for me till a few days ago. And I was like, no, it's her.
Right.
And I didn't really realize it was going to be so over so fast. I thought she could really last longer.
I thought she would last.
Is she done? Is it official?
No, but
practically, right?
It's not looking
So,
good.
and we all think she's the smartest, plan, detail, whatever. But
she's
we
a
always
woman,
knew it would be a
and-
challenge because of sexism in America, right?
Exactly.
And I like Bernie. I'm a registered independent, so I kind of kick back and wait for people to figure it out, and then I'm cool because I think it's all shenanigans at that level. Oftentimes, I'm more of a proponent of local voting and participating.
Got it.
But why so much love for Biden?
I don't think
in
it was
Southern America.
Well, one, I think you had the endorsement of several key figures who have civil rights history credibility that was going to sway people who were already leaning that way.
Clyburn in South Carolina.
I mean, him coming out, I think that was like raising Lazarus from the dead. Like, he was able to endorse Biden at a time that I think a lot of people were questioning. But I think that what we're seeing is that overwhelmingly, we already knew older African Americans were not going to be veering too far away from the Biden category. And he has a lot of history there. I think that people were voting because they knew that if a progressive if Elizabeth Warren did go forward, if a Bernie did go forward, there are not enough white people who are willing to risk that. I think we were voting, our communities basically were voting based on, listen, what is realistic, what's going to cause the least harm, and what's going to put us as close as we need to removing the current occupant of the White House. So they went safe.
It's an interesting thought, too, because we've been talking about progressives and how we feel, but and a lot of people feel, and I think you feel this way to some extent, that to not go forward is to go backwards, and to try to just go back to Joe Biden to normalize things is not real progress. But being uber progressive, let's be honest, there's a lot of privilege in that too.
There is.
Being like, no, I want to change the world now. It's like there are a lot of people who are just like, we need this to end, and get our feet settled. And I think you're probably right. A lot of people felt that anyone else, these other white people are not going to go out and support Bernie, and we'll get lost. And so Biden's the safest bet. He can grab those people, and maybe we'll have a shot.
It's far from over. And Bernie won California and Colorado. Right. I keep reminding people that, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. I know Florida's up for grabs and people are concerned because you got to win that. But is there a scenario where a president can get to the White House without winning Florida, but picking up Wisconsin, Michigan, California, Pennsylvania?
If you get the rest of them, if you get all those other
clear
ones,
sweep.
If you get Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, you'll be fine.
But I think at the end of the day, whether you are progressive or you were just enticed by progressive ideas, what's really going to be incumbent upon our communities to do is to engage in the on-the-ground work, right? So it's not just about the presidency, although the presidency is significant because, as I've said before, presidents pick judges, and they install those judges for a lifetime of positions.
And right now, if you don't get Trump up out of there, he's about to. We got Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the other liberal who are very, very old.
Right, and Sonia Sotomayor cannot be there by herself.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be a 7-2 swing.
Basically, we can literally be reinterpreted back into slavery. I don't know why people are not clear about this. Like, judicial interpretations are significant. But in addition to that, we also need to make sure that the Senate and people are actively engaged in who their senators are, who their House of Representatives are, and what their local government looks like. So here in the state of New York, we have recognized that we don't have, for example, the Voting Rights Act anymore. Essentially has been gutted by the Supreme Court. But on the state level, there is legislation now pending to have a state Voting Rights Act. And so we have to be way more engaged on the ground level in a way that doesn't just say I voted and that's it, but recognizing that the vote is like maybe step 7 of a 10-step process of going from an issue to a solution to having that solution implemented. And the vote really is important, but I feel like sometimes we put so much energy in focusing on that we forget the rest of civic engagement. We need people to be attending your local school board meetings, attending your local city city council meetings, making sure that when people in Albany or your state capital are about to vote on something, that you are organizing your community, not just to be reactionary, but to have, your own solutions and say, no, this is what we want. We oftentimes will say, well, what's your Black agenda or what's your Latino agenda? No, here's the agenda that we came up with, and we are hiring you to implement that agenda. So we have to really switch the way we engage with elected officials. We often have a
here's what we need you to do when we give you this job.
Here are the 5 things on our list, only one of which
but
is
a lot of
non-negotiable.
people don't even realize that that's what they're doing when they're voting.
Right.
They don't even realize that they're giving someone a job.
Right.
But it's also complicated because there are other groups who also are hiring that same person for the job.
Yeah.
And thus we have Barack Obama's presidency and most people's presidency of here he's not the Black president, he's the president.
Right.
And he's got to look out for you, and he's got to look out for you, and he's got to do the best he can.
But there are communities who, under Barack Obama, were able to effectuate their agenda. So if you look at the LGBT community, for example, they had an agenda. They did not say, what are you going to do for us? They said, here is what you're going to do for us. And they were able to go down several items
And
on
at
their
least get
list
some of them.
and got some of them.
Right.
Many in the African descendant community, because, again, we just got the right to register to vote in 1965 without facing bodily
ain't
harm.
all the way there.
But it's not there yet. It's coming. And so I think that as we engage more, as we have a lot more progressive groups, that we have a lot more groups that are thinking about how to be more critical about our elected officials and not see them so much as like pastors. We often have this deification of elected officials. And so as we see them more, it's like, no, this is a job and here are the positions, here are the items that we need you to fulfill. I think we'll be able to accomplish a whole lot more. And I'm hoping that we don't, should Biden get the nomination and should he ascend to the presidency, I'm really hoping that Black people will be able to overcome the Obama-itis that we were kind of under. And there was sort of this, it was like Black Camelot. It was beautiful. It was like him, Michelle, the girls. It was amazing. And nobody wanted to be critical in the first term because he had to get a second term. And then during the second term, he didn't have the House. So he didn't have the legislative capacity to really do anything. And most of what he did has been effectively undone. So I think that we've been there. We've done that. We've learned a lot of things. And now I'm hoping that regardless of who ascends into that position, we are going to be organized such that here are our agenda items. We can crowdsource them. We got social media in ways we didn't before. We can collaborate in ways we didn't before.
And we're paying attention. And people are paying
attention. And we recognize a lot more what's at risk.
A lot of people, let's be real, most young people's political interests started the day Barack Obama became a serious candidate.
Yeah.
So now there's more experience. There's people have been paying attention. By the way, Florida's 29 delegates. Michigan and Pennsylvania's 20, 16 in Michigan. So if you do pick up everything, you could get through. It just requires
it would be a lot. It would be a lot. To not get Florida in with that would be a lot.
For Bernie at this level, look, whoever's a Democratic candidate, that's what I'm voting for.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah.
I know that America as a whole, the whole picture, is not on the same page.
Right.
Like, we're just not. We live different lifestyles. It's just a whole different thing. I think there needs to be a candidate like Bernie that shakes the table, but has the right support system to actually help him get things done, right? Because I feel like young people who want to believe in the process and believe in the idea of making sure that the little guy, the hardworking person, the union person can actually get taken care of, and somebody who, in theory, fights against the billionaires and fight. I think that's essential in a lot of people who will never be a billionaire, don't see themselves that way, don't even see themselves as being a millionaire and hate the whole idea. They need that to continue to participate. There's going to be a lot of people who are young that if Bernie's not the candidate, they're going to be apathetic. They're just going to be like,
well, we saw that last time.
But that's exactly the wrong thing to do. And I think that undermines because it's not about Bernie. It's about what he stood for, right? So if you believe in Medicare for all or medical coverage for all, whatever you want to call it, then we need you to be active in every single one of those spaces that I just mentioned and pushing that agenda. If you believe that student loans should be...
So what you're saying is Bernie may not get through.
But his plan could.
Pivot.
Right.
And make sure you're doing it on the ground.
Exactly, because you can force Biden, should Biden be the nominee, and I'm almost speaking presumptively as if he is, but you could force whoever that person is to the left. That's what the Tea Party did, right? They came in, they were organized, and yes, they had funding, but they were organized in a way that they pushed their representatives so far to the right that there was no outline.
And that's how you ended up with a Trump.
And they
that's
do it,
how you ended up with a Trump.
And they did it through businesses, too. They did it through protesting and attacking people, because remember, Biden is a politician.
Yeah.
I think he's a good man generally. I don't think he's I think he believes in sort of basic American philosophies. And I trust him in that regard 1,000,000 times more than our current president who doesn't care about America at all. But you can get Biden further left.
You can.
We have to do that.
Right.
And let's be honest, Bernie and Warren have already done that to some degree. You
That's
could
true.
hear in Biden's language last night that he is a different candidate in the way he addresses a room than how he did a couple of years ago. And if we lose Bernie or Warren or one of the more progressives that we may be more in love with, we can still have an effect on making Biden an effective president for us.
So if you look at student loans, for example, part of the reason that people can't discharge their student loans in bankruptcy right now is because of Biden, right? But if you were to say, listen, we were willing to vote for you.
I think you have to say that again louder.
Yeah, so part of the reason that people cannot discharge their student loan debt in bankruptcy is because of legislation that Biden was a part of. The reason that we have Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court is because of people like Biden. So the crime bill. So, I mean, there are things that we can look to that say, this is very problematic. However, we now have had a progressive awakening such that people are very clear. I want my student loan debt canceled. I want affordable housing. I think Medicare for everybody is a human right. And so being able to say, listen, Biden, if you are going to be the nominee, here are all the things that we need to see happen, and we are going to push you forward. Not just you, but we want every single candidate who's on the ballot to adopt a progressive agenda. It may have to come in a form we don't like, but the agenda can still be accomplished if the people stay organized and activated.
Well said.
Lurie Daniel-Favors is her name. We talked about black on the census. When do these things show up in our mailboxes?
March 12th is when the first postcards are going to start hitting mailboxes, which means you have to check your mail. And I know because I represented people of African descent that we often don't check our mail, which is how we miss summonses and we miss a whole lot of other things.
Can you skip the mail and just go online and do it?
You can go online and you can look up your information based on your address. However, we must be clear that the census has been severely underfunded to the extent that it's operating on a budget that was less than what they had to work with in 2010. That is intentional. That's
and
because
they want it
y'all's
to
president.
be broken.
They want it to be broken because it is in the benefit. There are a lot of people who do not want black and brown communities showing up on the census. It is to their benefit.
The same way they don't want
them
them to vote, which is why in Texas they're waiting 7 hours to vote.
Yeah, I was
yesterday.
going to ask about voter suppression really quickly because I've seen more and more articles and people actually exposing it. I mean, we've seen it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Right? What can we do about voter suppression besides like voicing our opinions on social media?
Well, and that's a great start, but it really is just sort of screaming into the void on some level. I'd mentioned earlier that we no longer have the Voting Rights Act the way that we had, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And the last election we had was the first election that did not have the protections of a Voting Rights Act. So if we had had the Voting Rights Act in place, all of the poll changes and closures that we see happening in Texas would have had to have been approved and cleared by the Department of Justice. That didn't happen because the Supreme Court gutted that power. So what we're doing in New York is fighting for a state Voting Rights Act because voter suppression is real. And if I can keep you from voting, that's one of the best ways of ensuring that, like the poll tax, it's better than a poll tax. It's better than a literacy test. So we need people who are thinking about these things to be asking your elected officials on the local level, what are we going to do about voting rights in this country? How is it, or in this state? How are we going to ensure that you can't just move my poll site 10 days before the election and I don't know about it? So I'm going to the school that I've been voting at for the past 11 years and you moved it to someplace that's far across town. How do we, when we meet with your elected officials, ask them where do they stand on a state Voting Rights Act? You can look at states like California, you can look at states like Washington, which have already passed them, and mirror that language and think about implementing that in your own state. But what I'm talking about really is us having a way higher level of political engagement than we're typically accustomed to. And I think we often approach government in this country almost like a monarchy, like a kingship. Like, well, we elected somebody, go handle it. That is not how this thing works. So if you get a job, your boss doesn't hire you and just say, go work. They are constantly monitoring you. They're evaluating you. If you're messing up, they're checking you. They're pulling you into the office, having conversations with you. That's what our role as voters is supposed to be on our elected officials. So when your poll sites are closing, get you, your friends, your girlfriends, your mom and them, head down to your local elected official. Hello, what are you doing about this? In fact, we know what we want you to do about this because in the state of New York, in the state of California, in the state of Washington, this is what they did. This is what they're doing. So we want to make sure that we have a Voting Rights Act that's going to protect us. We don't want voter suppression. It should not be that we are waiting 15, 20, 30, 40 hours to stand in line to cast our vote. That is suppression. That is diluting our vote. So here's what we want you to do about it. It's often easier to complain than it is to organize. But we need people to shift out of that mindset. We have got to organize. Otherwise, we are going to be trumped on out of our positions, on out of power, and on out of our communities.
Or like I always say, play around if y'all want to. My bank account's going to be good, but,
Again, that probably doesn't help her, but that's not the message you can have in her position.
It doesn't work.
I'm going to be good. No, it doesn't help.
Yo, Lurie, I love you.
Love you back.
Thank you so
guys.
much.
Thank you. That was great.
You guys.
Look for it in the mail. Census 2020.